Hi, welcome back to the Black Pill. We've got some daylight and the hearse is warmed up. Let's talk about psychology. Today, specifically, we're talking about the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, the Great Earthquake. And psychology is dog shit. It's a weird thing for a psychologist to say. But here we go. The 2008 Great Earthquake of Sichuan changed my life in many good ways and is a terrible catastrophe. Overnight, 100,000 people died, right? When the earthquake hit, 100,000 people were more or less instantly killed. Many of them children. This happened in the midst of a school day, and several schools collapsed, just burying all of the children within. The Chinese government pretty much covered those up with concrete and turned them into monuments, rather than have investigations that would reveal the poor structural quality of those schools and the graft that led them to be constructed with such poor quality. So hundreds of thousands of parents, if they themselves did not die, lost children in the earthquake and were never able to recover those bodies and even do proper burials. This was a catastrophe of the first order. Many times earthquakes of this magnitude are followed by a humanitarian disaster, as in Haiti. But the Chinese government had resources and the will to respond, and it was okay. It was okay. Like, people didn't starve to death or thirst to death or die of dysentery in the aftermath of that earthquake. Following this event, my friend Mark was in Hong Kong, and he wanted to help. He wanted to help in some way, but he had a little Cantonese. In Hong Kong, the Chinese language is Cantonese instead of, I guess we would say the mainland Chinese language is Mandarin, and the Chinese would just say it's Chinese and everything is Chinese. Mandarin maybe even at least a little bit of a slur. So he had a little Cantonese, but not enough Mandarin Chinese, mainland Chinese, to actually go and be effective. When disasters like this happen, a whole bunch of Westerners show up trying to sort of earn their chops and do studies on people who haven't consented to being studied and sort of prove their pet theories about trauma. And this is not helpful to people. After the Indonesian tsunami, for example, people had material needs. They needed food and clean drinking water, a place to stay, and to be reunited with their families. But they were virtually bribed and coerced into taking part in psychological studies of PTS and treatments for PTS by well-intentioned Westerners who were unable to notice their own cultural lenses. They spent a lot of time sitting in camps, waiting to be given food or water. The cost of material support was to sit and listen to talks about PTS through a Western lens. So Mark didn't want to do any of this, to cause any of this. He knew that if he just showed up in Chengdu trying to help people directly, he couldn't stay for very long. He could stay for at most a week, which is not enough to form therapeutic alliances and relationships with the victims of the disaster. And for the week that he was there, he would be a material burden on the people actually able to do the work over the long term. So that's not what he wanted. So what he came up with was, instead, he set up a program of helping the helpers. So there were psychiatry and psychology professionals in Chengdu who would go out into the countryside and spend a few hours every weekend with the people affected by this disaster, the survivors of this disaster who'd been displaced and put into sort of rapidly fabricated villages and had lost family members, jobs, farms, ways of life. The relief workers, a year later, now it's 2009, and the relief workers were exhausted. They were running out of hope, honestly. When we're doing therapy, we expect and hope for our clients to get better, to feel better. But how do you feel better when your entire life is gone? You're a 55-year-old woman, your daughter is dead, and your granddaughter is dead, and your husband is dead. You've been moved off of your property where you've lived for generations into this sort of rapidly built concrete apartment complex in a new village. How are you supposed to feel better? Should you get over it, move on, and start fresh? And the answer turns out to be no. Even if you should, you couldn't. And so the relief workers, they're working all week in Chengdu and then all weekend in the villages and seeing no real hope or no real progress. So I was a graduate student in 2009, and I was invited to visit China with Mark and my mentor, Lewis, and a few other graduate students. And Mark just likes to put people together. He likes to find interesting people in psychology and put them in a room together and just sort of see what develops between them. It's kind of a genius way of getting the work done, and a very generous way of getting the work done. So in 2009, I was mostly an observer of this process, just being a student, no jobs, no license, no nothing. And so, as part of the Chinese tour, Mark has us visit Chengdu and visit these relief workers he's been working with. So Chengdu is a large and very gray communist city. It is there's a lot of concrete, and the days we were there, it was overcast and drizzling and raining and cold. We met these relief workers from a local psychiatric institute at a campus, at a university campus, that the wing was closed down, and on reflection, I'm not sure we were supposed to be there. Like, there was no running water. We had to pack in water. There was no heat, and some of the windows were broken out. So we just sort of huddled in our coats under blankets, talking. People had very sophisticated electronics, which didn't fit in with this, like, World War II era semi-abandoned building with no electricity or running water. And we huddled under blankets and drank cup after cup of hot tea to stay warm. So these Chinese relief workers were very wary of a bunch of white Westerners. Mark had a certain amount of grace because he's not white. We had no grace whatsoever, except as friends and colleagues of Mark, and I'd barely even met Mark by this point. They were very wary. They knew what had happened in places like Indonesia after the tsunami. A bunch of people coming with help that isn't very helpful and that is ultimately self-serving. So people had come and gone. Westerners had come and gone from Germany and France and Sweden and Switzerland and America and Britain. They'd all depleted some of the resources, arguably trying to be of service, but costing more than they brought with them to get any work done. And they were all critical. They were all quite critical of the way that the local Chinese relief workers were building relationships with the people out in the provinces and the countryside. And so The first person to speak, a young man, almost did his internship year in psychiatry, very charming fellow who would become a fast and lifelong friend. He loads up his slides running on battery, projector running on battery, puts a slide on the wall, and the very first slide is psychology is dog shit. And that was our first clue that this might be a sort of a hostile witness, bit of a hostile witness. Everyone had been very gracious, and we'd been made to feel very much at home. Chinese hospitality is legendary, and then we sit in this cold room with hot tea, and the very first slide is psychology is dog shit. And what my friend goes on to say is, first, let's talk Taoism. There's a old story in Taoism and sometimes in Buddhism, because they're not totally separate, they're not completely separate. There's this old story about a master meditating by the roadside. For some reason in the old stories, masters are always meditating by the roadside. I don't know why they can't just meditate at home or something. There's a performative aspect to this, of course. There's a master meditating by the roadside, and the young scamp wanders by. Another thing that's always in the stories, the young scamp wanders by and says, "What are you doing?" And the master says, "I'm meditating." And the scamp says, "What are you meditating on?" "Well, I'm meditating on the Tao that is everything." "Oh, everything, you say? Everything. So the Tao is in the sky." "Yes, of course, the Tao is in the sky." "So the Tao is in this food." "Yes, of course." "And the Tao is in me." "Yes." "And it's in you." "Yes." "And it's between us." "Yes, of course it is." "And the Tao is in that dog shit." And the master is sort of forced to concede that, yes, the Tao is in the dog shit. The Tao is dog shit. If the Tao is everything, then the Tao is the things we might aspire to and the things we might aspire away from. If the Tao is everything, everything includes some unsavory things. Of course, obviously. And the young scamp wanders off, laughing at the master. And this is half of what my friend says when he says psychology is dog shit. Psychology is in everything. It's in you, it's in me, it's between us, it's in all human interactions, whether or not those interactions are very savory. That's what he wants to say. Yeah. But he also wants to say that psychology is normal. It's normal. And what these relief workers resent is people who have no history in the region, no concept of the culture, no real material investment, no long-term investment coming in and telling them that they're not doing things correctly. And they've gotten a year of this. They've gotten a year of this from Western psychologists and psychiatrists. They're not happy about it. And so we hear about what these relief workers have actually been doing. We're existential psychologists. We're not Freudians. We're not behaviorists. We're not trauma specialists. We're existentialists. And when my friend is done with the thing about psychology is dog shit, like, it's a standing ovation. He tells me later he was very nervous about saying this because he doesn't want to offend anybody, but he also wants to stand his ground and stand up for himself and his group and what he believes. And he did not expect that we would say, yeah, you're right, psychology is dog shit. And the way you've been treated was very bad. And that's why we became such lifelong such lifelong friends. That's why I fell in love with China, with Chinese people. It was just this effacing, brave self-honesty. So what are they actually doing out there? In 2009, they'd been through a year of trying to get bereaved Chinese people to sit in therapy, to sit in individual therapy, to sit in group therapy, and like talk about their feelings about the people they have lost. Talk about their feelings about the future that they had lost. Um, yeah, if you are 50 and your daughter has died, the only child that the government has allowed you is dead, you can't have another child, and how are you supposed to get over that? How are you supposed to process it? And we're talking about people who are psychologically unsophisticated, which is not at all a diss or a put down. It means they don't live in a culture that's grown up reading Atlantic comics about Sigmund Freud. Right? They don't know anything about therapy or uh, how to have emotional discourses in any way at all. They can't make use of all this Freudian stuff that Westerners are bringing in. And so these conversations haven't gone very well. Getting people to sit down and have them hasn't gone well. So instead, the relief workers had started to sort of abandon the formal aspects of psychotherapy and instead try and do things that are helpful. Yeah. So they'll drive the 3 hours or so into the countryside, and then when the road runs out, hike the last 3 or 4 miles into the village, and they're carrying supplies, food and water, so they're not a burden on the village, but also bricks and boards, hammers and nails. And they would work alongside people out trying to rebuild their homes and villages. So now they're standing side by side, pounding nails into walls. And they might do that for 3 or 4 hours, building an alliance not by artificial means of rapport building, but by genuine and authentic means of sharing someone's troubles. And then after a few weeks along the way, maybe in the course of re-roofing this building so it can be reoccupied, one of the men who lost his wife might say, "I still miss her every day." And that's what you would get. And that was the most that man had expressed his feelings, maybe ever, certainly in the weeks of that association. And the relief workers would sit with the women in a communal space. They'd bring in a bunch of yarn and they'd do a great big knitting circle, everyone making scarves and gloves and hats. And they would just sit and knit together. And then eventually they would get to talking. And then sometimes someone would disclose a feeling. And it's not a formal group psychotherapy session where the therapist is moderating and mediating and making sure everyone gets a turn to talk and seeing how people react. It's just a natural conversation. It helps. It's helping. It's helping far more than trying to push farmers into formal psychotherapy, which wasn't working. One of the relief workers, a woman, her face is burned into my head. She's crying while she says this. In our session, she says, one of my clients, she came to me and said, "But what can you really do?" And I told her that I can be your advocate, and I can talk to you, and we can share feelings together, and I'll always listen to you. And she says, but I don't need any of that. I need a sister. Can you be my sister? And while my friend is telling this story, her face is streaming with tears because she's just heard from all these Westerners and professionals and high-minded licensed people. No, you can't. You have to divorce your feelings from your client's feelings. You can't attach to anybody. You certainly can't have a relationship as intimate as sisterhood. And she felt so helpless, so so useless, a gigantic hypocrite. Like she was going into the villages and taking instead of giving. Whereas in fact, she had given everything. She'd given everything. My friend, who was about to finish his psychiatry program, had given up his psychiatry program. That all the time he should have been spending writing his dissertation so he could graduate and license, he was instead spending in the provinces with a hammer in his hand and a couple of nails in his mouth. It took him an extra 3 years to finish medical school and finish his residency. Psychology is dog shit. Yeah, psychology is in people who show up at disaster sites with no mind whatsoever for the culture that they're in, thinking that their diagnostic criteria apply all over the world, and the best way to help people is diagnose them and have them do Western style therapy. And psychology is also, it's also in the people who drive into the countryside and hike the last few miles in so they can stand next to a bereaved man and help him rebuild his house and just listen without demanding anything. Just listen, mostly to the sound of nails being pounded into wood. And sometimes to a real authentic feeling that can't be shared in any other way. Yeah, I'm overclimbed. That's enough for me. That's enough for now. That's enough.